Hello, everyone. I'm Carrie Kennedy, president of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion on the free Rusesabagina campaign. I'm happy to be joined today by my esteemed panelists, Paul Rusesabagina's daughter, Ananis Kanimba, award-winning actor and activist Don Cheadle, award-winning and world-acclaimed screenwriter and director Terry George, lead counsel for Paul's legal team, Kate Gibson, Africa's staff attorney at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, Ikechukwu Uzoma, executive vice president of Freedom House, Nicole Bibbins-Sadaka, and president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice, Katrina Lantos-Sweat. I'd like to thank the Lantos Foundation, Freedom House, Represent for co-sponsoring this important discussion. At Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, we believe that Bobby Kennedy's words ring true. He said the sharpest criticism often goes hand in hand with the deepest idealism and love of country. This is our motivation in supporting the protection and promotion of freedom of expression across the world, including in Africa. We firmly believe that dissent plays an essential role in democratic governance, and states have a responsibility to protect and respect the right to express dissenting opinions to the degree provided by international law. Paul Rusesabagina's ordeal at the hands of the Rwandan government is emblematic of a worrying trend of systemic repression of voices critical of the government. Dissent is an essential component of the right to freedom of expression and opinion, a right protected by international, regional, and Rwandan domestic law. For 26 years, Paul and his family faced varying forms of attacks and retaliation for his criticism of the Rwandan government. Following a failed assassination attempt, he sought and obtained political asylum in Belgium and subsequently relocated to the United States after he was subjected to coordinated transnational reprisals, including personal and family intimidation, death threats, harassment, a burglary of his home. His most recent abduction, illegal transfer from Dubai to Kigali, then subsequent enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention, and inhumane treatment are part of a systemic operation of the Rwandan government to stifle opposition and punish critics both at home and abroad. The recent opinion of the United States Working Group on Arbitrary Detention in response to a petition filed by RFK Human Rights and the report by the Clooney Foundation's Trial Watch established that Rwanda egregiously violated human rights law and the abduction, rendition, and unfair trial of Paul Rusesabagina. The United States Working Group's inquiry found that Paul's abduction and enforced disappearance, quote, violate numerous substantive and procedural provisions of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and constitute a particularly aggravated form of arbitrary detention, unquote. The Trial Watch report reveals a string of procedural improprieties and a breach of fair trial guarantees, including the Rwandan government depriving Paul of access to his counsel of choice and a facility to prepare his defense. The report also notes that the court had unjustifiably admitted inadmissible and unverified evidence obtained through coercion and force. It is clear that Paul's treatment, which has been marked with utter disregard for the law, due process, and humanity, is not a result of the government's allegations, but instead is punishment for his political views and criticisms of the Rwandan government. A cancer survivor with hypertension and heart disease, Paul has been subjected to detention for over 580 days, 260 of which were spent in solitary confinement. The Rwandan government also denies Paul access to his doctor-prescribed medication, and so both his physical and mental health have deteriorated significantly. Today, we join our voices with the international community to demand that Paul Rusesabagina be immediately and unconditionally released and returned to his family. Rwanda must free Rusesabagina. Thank you. I will now pass the floor to Paul's extraordinary daughter, Anna-Anise Kanimba, to briefly share about their family's experience.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you so much for hosting this discussion about my father. My father has been in prison, illegally detained for over 580 days now. It is 580 days without saying goodnight to him, without giving him a hug, and without even seeing his eyes in his body. We are extremely worried for his safety. We're extremely worried for his life. And many people ask us, why did my father end up there? What did he do? The only thing that my father did was to stand up for injustice and to do the right thing. Ever since the Rwandan genocide, even before, my father has always had this principle to do the right thing when he sees some things happening. He did it during the genocide, and that's how many of you have known to know him. And that continued after that, And he wanted to make sure that people would not see the injustices in Rwanda do not go unseen. And that made the Rwandan president, Kagame, angry. He does not like critics. He doesn't like anybody who criticizes anything that's happening in the country. And that's why my father is there, because he dared to criticize what was happening, because he dared to stand up for what was right, because he dared to call for the injustice. And now my dad is away from us. He's sick, he's ill. He hasn't had the medication that he needs for the last 180 days. We believe he had a stroke, and we don't have time. We don't have time, and that's why we need your help. We need the help of the international community. We need the help of the world so that he can come back to us, so that his injustice that he's living ends. So he can continue and to be by our side, but he can continue among all of us, call for the injustice around the world and help all the others he had before. And so I would like to call for your support, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Anais. We're so inspired by your family's courage and really so very honored to stand with you through all these difficult times. And thank you for the bravery of coming out here and talking about this incredibly difficult subject to all the world. We will now transition to Oscar-nominated and multi-time Golden Globe winning actor and activist Don Cheadle. Don, who played Paul in the movie Hotel Rwanda, is without question one of the most highly sought after and premier actors of his generation. He serves as a UN ambassador for the UN Environmental Program and has shared a Peace Summit Award with George Clooney for their work on Darfur. The floor is yours, Don.
Thank you. One of the greatest honors of my life was to have been given the opportunity to draw the world's attention to the atrocities that occurred in Rwanda in 1994 by helping to tell the story of the genocide through the experiences of Paul Rusesabagina, his family, and many, many others during those fateful days. It is a story that has stayed with me and always will for the rest of my life. What's more, it gave me the opportunity to get to know Paul, who I've only experienced as a soft-spoken, kind man, one who deeply cares for Rwanda and its people. His love for his family and theirs for him has also always been a source of inspiration for me. After the film was released and seen around the world, I also had the opportunity on several occasions, both in Rwanda and here in the United States to spend time with President Kagame. And in all of my interactions with him, I've been shown kindness, generosity, up to and including he and his wife hosting my family at their residence. So now, given my experiences and my personal contacts with both men, it has been very difficult to process what has happened to my friend Paul Rusesabagina. As many on this panel have noted, there is no credible evidence whatsoever that Paul is a terrorist, not even close. Paul is an advocate for human rights and democracy. And as many have stated, there's no question that Paul has been mistreated. His basic fundamental rights have clearly not been respected or recognized in the circumstances underlying his arrest and during the trial proceedings. So it's been very difficult for me to reconcile my experience with President Kagame, who's always positioned himself to be a level-headed statesman, a man known for his leniency and temperance by rejecting the option of violent reprisals in the aftermath of the genocide when many around him were calling for just that. It's hard to reconcile with being the same person admittedly responsible for Paul's abduction, but such is the case. And now it's been over a year. And Paul Rusesabagina has more than given his pound of flesh. And my hope is that this will turn out to be an opportunity. Rwanda and the United States are allies, and I'm hopeful that the two countries can yet be partners to further peace and prosperity in Central Africa. It's a relationship that is not beyond redemption. So I'm asking President Kagame that you extend the grace that you have shown to me and my family to Paul and his family now. Please lead with mercy. Paul is 67 years old. His health issues are serious and persistent. He needs to have immediate and consistent medical attention, and he needs to be with his family. I'm also addressing this to the international community, asking that you continue to ring the bell, continue to advocate for Paul's release so that we can bring this situation to an end.
Thank you, Don, for your statement and for your very powerful intervention today, and for all your work on behalf of Paul over the years. Our next speaker is award-winning and world-acclaimed screenwriter and director Terry George. Terry is an Oscar-nominated writer and director known for Hotel Rwanda, In the Name of the Father, Some Mother's Son, and The Promise. It's a pleasure to have you here, Terry.
Thanks, Carrie, and thanks to Anais and Dawn and everyone else for participating in this vital forum today. You know, it's been it's over 17 years now since we started the journey of telling Paul Rusesabagina's story. And obviously I had intended to make a movie about what had taken place at the Mille Collines Hotel and Paul's heroism. And now this has grown into the seminal and classic story of the manipulation of media, the use of power against the individual, the destruction of truth. And it has gone from what I thought was a powerful story when we told the film into this just unbelievable story of 21st century manipulation and control by these authoritarian figures. I first came upon Paul's story when I was sent the script of my co-writer, Keir Pearson, the initial draft, and I read it and I thought, this story is incredible. I have to investigate and if possible, tell this story in cinema, in the most powerful medium at that time available. So I traveled to Brussels and I was picked up at the airport by a taxi driver called Paul Rusesabagina. I drove in his taxi. We sat in a cafe and we talked initially of where he came from, where his family were doing now. And over the course of the next 3 days in Brussels, I listened to this man and gathered that if his story was true, this was an incredible act of heroism by an ordinary man who had managed to save over 1,000 people. So I then returned from Brussels to New York and began serious research into the story that he had told. And the story was not unknown. It was pretty publicly covered both by the great Alison DeForge, fantastic human rights documentarian, Philip Gurevich in his book. It was covered in Condé Nast Traveler as the story of the heroism of one hotel manager. And Steve Bradshaw of the BBC had also covered it. So there was a lot of documentary evidence about what had taken place from April 8th, 1994, I believe, the genocide kicked off, and what Paul's actions were in that hotel in Kigali. I gathered all the information that was available from the books and did an enormous amount of research, and Paul's story basically checked out. I then asked him, would he go back with me to Rwanda to talk to some of the survivors, to get further information, and for allowing me to get a sense of the country itself, what had taken place during the genocide, and just the enormity of the crime that had happened and the enormity of Paul's bravery. I went back with Paul and Tatiana to Kigali in 2002. I stayed at the hotel. Paul was greeted like a hero by the people who had survived there, by the workers. I met ministers from the government. I met multitudes of survivors around Kigali and around the country, all who verified Paul's story. So, and I traveled around to the genocide memorial sites, and particularly to one at Murambi, where thousands of people had been murdered over the course of 3 days. I traveled there with a Rwandan government minister. And I was so deeply moved that I wrote in the condolences book, I have to tell this story, and came back to New York and along with Keir wrote the script again. And lucky for me, I managed to persuade Don Cheadle to play the part of Paul in a movie that was funded by numerous cinema producers around the world, English, Italian, Canadian, and United Artists in the United States. We shot the film mostly in South Africa, but we did also shoot in Rwanda. The opening sequence of the film, which is a helicopter shot of the Paul's van driving towards Kigali, was shot from a Rwandan army helicopter. The army allowed us flew us and allowed us to film. So there was active participation, not just by government ministers, but by the authorities themselves in the movie that we were making. We made the movie. Our expectations were pretty low because it was a small independent film, hard to break through in the market. But we went to Toronto Film Festival. We won the film festival. We got enormous acclaim there, and we were on the road to the Oscar race. The movie had quite enormous influence around the United States, particularly, and in Europe. But it seemed to bring to the attention not just what happened in Rwanda, but what was going on in Africa at the time, particularly in Darfur. And it struck a chord with people. And we ended up with 3 nominations at the Oscars. Paul and I traveled the country to great acclaim. And then eventually Paul was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Bush. Shortly after the film was released in the United States, I returned to Rwanda with Tatiana. Paul was supposed to come with me on that journey to show the film in Rwanda. At the last minute, he changed his mind. When I got to Kigali, we screened the film in the Intercontinental Hotel ballroom to the whole Parliament of Rwanda. I sat between President Kagame and his wife, and we watched the film. He laughed when his image appeared on screen, as it does in the film. He turned to me and thanked me for making the film. The next day, I went to the presidential compound. I met him again. I talked about the influence that the film was having around the United States, how various companies and people that I have met were willing to invest in Rwanda, and that I hoped that the film would stimulate a better life for the Rwandans after the genocide.
Mm.
He thanked me again. I have a photograph of him shaking my hand. I have a photograph of him sitting with me at the screening of the film. I was thanked by numerous parliamentarians. The following night, I showed the film in the Amahoro Stadium, which had been a refuge for refugees during the genocide. And I showed it to some 5,000 or 6,000 people. It was the most moving screening I've ever attended in my life. There were howls of anguish and tears afterwards. The film was universally received in Rwanda at the time. A year later, Paul's book, An Ordinary Man, came out, in which Paul criticized the electoral success of President Kagame, where he received 96% of the vote. And from that moment on, Hotel Rwanda became the center of a disinformation campaign, and mostly in Rwanda, but some of it in the United States. The film that we had created was not true. In particular, the New Times newspaper mounted a continuous campaign. They went back to the people that I had interviewed and had them change their statements about what had taken place. This was a classic example of manipulation of media to turn the truth on its head. Clearly, the government had decided, once Paul had become an activist against what was taking place in Rwanda, that the film had to be denounced as untrue. There were numerous articles put out by the Rwandan government in various newspapers in the United States. I responded to them right away. And each time I responded, I presented the facts, and there was no challenge to what I was saying. The fact of the matter is, what people watched in Hotel Rwanda is what basically took place within that hotel at the time, under the constraints of making a feature film about an event that spread over 2 months. And it was clear to me that Paul's challenge and his fame, his challenge to President Kagame's political activities in Rwanda was clearly the reason that the film was being denounced. On several occasions, President Kagame himself denounced Paul. And since that time, since the time of the denunciation of the film, both Paul Rusesabagina's human rights activities have grown, and President Kagame and the Rwandan government's denunciation of the film and attacks against Paul have grown as well. And I think that this, as we see authoritarianism grow around the world, whether it's in North Korea or in Russia or in Africa, this is a classic example of where we have to stand up for the truth. And we have to stand up for an individual who fought for other people and defend Paul. And we must rally around him to get him out of prison now. Because if Paul Rusesabagina suffers in prison, we all suffer. And the whole notion of truth, the whole notion of telling the truth through movies, through television, of propagating the activities of human rights activists will be destroyed. We can't, this is a bigger issue. It's an issue for Hollywood, it's an issue for Washington, it's an issue for Brussels. And I, for one, will continue to fight to have Paul released and hopefully save his life. Thanks, Kerry.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you so much for that impassioned plea from somebody who really dug so deeply and personally into all the facts of the case, and who knows so much the power of film and the power of lies. And I just cannot thank you enough for
Thank you.
For your intervention, and also for your whole life's work. raising these issues. My brother-in-law is featured in the name of the Father, and you're an extraordinary filmmaker, and we're so grateful to you to be here today. We are now going to go further on the legal side with Paul's attorney, Kate Gibson. She's the lead counsel of Paul's legal team. The floor is yours, Kate.
Thank you very much, Kerry, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. Very briefly, for context, I've been working in and around the Rwandan criminal justice system since 2005, spending much time in Rwanda working with the judges and lawyers to try and build the capacity of the Rwandan judicial sector. When I heard that Paul Rusesabagina had been arrested, my first thought was that the Rwandan judiciary, knowing that the world would be watching, would bend over backwards to make sure that Paul had the fairest of fair trials, a trial that was unimpeachable. And I still can't quite believe the extent to which the opposite happened. A trial that was so unfair that the International Independent Trial Monitor, Jeffrey Robertson QC, took the extraordinary step of coming out in advance of the verdict and saying, it's over, that the mass violations of Paul's rights during the trial mean that any eventual verdict will be worthless. Because really, from the moment that Paul was kidnapped, this was over. No fair process begins with a defendant being abducted, illegally rendered, never given an arrest warrant, and then being, tied up, starved, physically tortured, coerced to make a false confession. At this point, it was already done. But as we now know, apart from what was happening to Paul in secret in Kigali behind closed doors, the violations of his right as an accused just continued in plain sight. And it would have been such an easy thing to give Paul the lawyers of his choosing, to give him a copy of the case file, to let him see a witness list, to let his lawyers bring him documents, to let him hold documents, sign documents. To this day, he still isn't allowed to do that. It would have been an easy thing not to harass his lawyers, not to harass his family, not to put Pegasus on their phone, and for the president of Rwanda not to stand up on the morning the trial started and say on national television, Paul is guilty and he will pay. These are easy things. These are basic things. These are prerequisite components of any competent, impartial, independent judicial system, and they were missing in Paul's case. And I want to take just one moment to talk about our lawyers in Kigali who were eventually assigned to Paul, who I won't name, but who have been subjected to unthinkable indignities over and over again as the price for representing Paul. I won't go into details because they wouldn't want me to, but it weighs really heavily on us as the rest of his legal team, and weighs heavily on Paul, which is why I think it's done. Lawyers have a right to represent accused free from recrimination and harassment, and that it also is not happening in this case. When Paul was arrested, there were lots of questions about why this is happening. Is he a terrorist? They're saying he's a terrorist. Why is he going to trial? Surely they must have some evidence. He wouldn't be in court if there wasn't some evidence against him. I'm going to spend my last minute just putting that to bed. We watched the trial. We have a copy of the prosecution case file. We have the judgment. there is no credible evidence of any criminal or terrorist activity on behalf of Paul Rusesabagina, which is why, coming full circle, the Rwandan government was required to kidnap him to even get him in front of a court of law. I'll stop there, but I'd be really happy to answer any questions anyone has about the trial and appeal process on the ground. And thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for your impassioned plea for your client, for Paul, this extraordinary hero who's been so maligned, and for pointing out some of the very many ways that that the government has failed in their responsibility for due process. He is very lucky to have you leading his legal team. Thank you. And now our next speaker is my colleague, Ikechukwu Uzoma. He is Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Staff Attorney for Africa, and he's going to share more about the opinion of the UN Working Group on arbitrary detention in Paul's case.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And it's great to be on this panel. Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights is glad to support the Free Rusesabagina campaign. Following Mr. Rusesabagina's abduction, we submitted a petition to the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention on behalf of Paul and his family in March 2021. Last month, the working group published a strong opinion describing Paul's treatment by the Rwandan authorities as constituting a particularly aggravated form of arbitrary detention. Now, why is this opinion relevant? The United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention is a 30-year-old special mechanism of the United Nations comprised of international law experts from all parts of the world. One of their main responsibilities is to consider cases of illegal deprivation of liberty, also known as arbitrary detention. Given its experience and expertise, the opinions of the working group are the most authoritative on the subject of illegal or arbitrary detention. In its opinion in Paul's case, the working group asserts that his detention was arbitrary under 4 different categories. In the first category, the working group asserts that it is clearly impossible to invoke any legal basis justifying Rwanda's deprivation of Paul's liberty. The opinion concludes that abducting and holding Paul at a location unknown to his family and lawyers is a deprivation of liberty analogous to enforced disappearance, and it lacks any valid legal basis under any circumstance. The second category, the working group asserts that Mr. Rusesabagina's deprivation of liberty is or was an attempt to curb his dissent by intimidating him and others associated with his work. It affirms that his situation was a result of the exercise of his right to freedom of opinion and expression. In the third category, the working group found that Rwanda failed to observe international norms relating to the right to fair trial, as is further elucidated in the Trial Watch report that Kate spoke about. Finally, the working group found that Mr. Rusesabagina's detention and treatment was discriminatory, as he was targeted for his activism as a human rights defender and his political opposition to the government. The working group requests, through its opinion, that the Rwandan government immediately releases Mr. Rusesabagina, accords him the right to compensation and other reparations in accordance with international law, and conducts a full and independent investigation into Mr. Rusesabagina's arbitrary deprivation of liberty. Freeing Rusesabagina is the working group's request. Freeing Rusesabagina is the right thing to do. freeing Rusesabagina is a requirement under international law. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ikechukwu, for your extraordinary work on this and for reporting back on the UN's conclusions. And now our next speaker is Nicole Bibbins-Sadaka, Executive Vice President of Freedom House. Nicole oversees Freedom House's strategy and programs, including the great work on transitional repression, which is one of the many human rights abuses against Paul. Thank you, Nicole, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me to speak among all of these advocates working to free Paul. Around the world, we know that human rights defenders are raising their voices to shine a light on human rights abuses and to bring change for all of those who have been denied freedom. And we know that in many cases, this is a dangerous action, as their governments or others who are threatened by words target these courageous activists. And what's less well known is that these efforts to silence human rights defenders are not contained by borders. The tool that you just mentioned, Carrie, the tool of transnational repression is increasingly used to silence activists living outside of their home country. The Kagame regime in Rwanda is one of the world's worst perpetrators of transnational repression. And the people most at risk, the Rwandans most at risk, are human rights defenders like Paul, independent journalists, and regime critics. And that repression comes around the world in many forms: digital surveillance, spyware attacks, harassing exiled people's families inside and outside of the country, and even assassination. And in many cases, authoritarian governments will use false pretenses or threats to lure its target out of the country where they live, where they've sought asylum, and into a neutral third country. And from there, they kidnap them back to their country of origin, subjecting them to trials which are most often not free and fair, and imprisonment or even worse. And this is unquestionably what has happened to Paul Rusesabagina, when the government of Rwanda decided that his human rights advocacy, his courage, his willingness to tell the truth, the way his account of the 1994 genocide differs from the official story, and his outspoken criticism of President Kagame, all of those things combined with his global prominence after the movie Hotel Rwanda, all of those made him a threat to the regime, or so they believed. A threat really just for simply speaking the truth. And in August 2020, all of us followed the events that unfolded there when Paul was living in Texas, and he was invited by a friend to speak at a church in Burundi, where he would travel by private plane. And then after his layover in Dubai, that plane flew to not to Burundi, but to Rwanda. And we've heard from Kate and from others about how the trial and others have really been a denial of the basic freedoms, on top of what has unquestionably been the regime's willingness to use transnational repression. President Kagame isn't even trying to hide that he has done this. He's actually bragging about it. He has called his plan to bring Paul Rusesabagina back to Rwanda flawless. The government has actually been using transnational repression since the 1990s, and we know that they've physically targeted Rwandans in at least 7 other countries since 2014, mostly in Africa. But Rwandans living as far away as the United States, Canada, and Australia fear surveillance and retribution. And the case of Paul Rusesabagina shows us that they are right to do so, because people are not safe outside of their own countries. We have to hold authoritarian regimes to account when they use tools like transnational repression, when they take political prisoners simply to target and silence their critics. We join in calling for the release of Paul Rusesabagina. And if we do not stand against authoritarians who use transnational repression, who take political prisoners, we know that life will continue to get worse for human rights defenders who try to speak the truth all around the world. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you for your insights into transnational repression and the tactics of the Rwandan government. Our next and final speaker in this part of the program is Katrina Lantos Swed. She's the president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. Katrina continues the legacy of her father, the late Congressman Tom Lantos, and I'm going to also add her extraordinary mother, who anybody who ever met her knows that she is a force of nature. So with those two gene pools, no wonder you're here today. Under her leadership, the Lantos Foundation has rapidly become a distinguished and respected voice on key human rights concerns. And we are so grateful for your support for Paul. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And what an honor it is for me to appear with this incredible panel. I know that every single person listening now must be fired up as I am to do everything in their power to free Paul Rusesabagina. You know, Nicole just spoke about the dangers of transnational repression, and I want to speak very briefly about the fact that when the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice in 2011 chose Paul Rusesabagina as the winner of the Lantos Human Rights Prize because he exemplified what it means to heroically shine a light in the midst of darkness and brutality, and he was exactly the sort of international human rights icon that we wanted to honor with our highest award, we became a target, the Lantos Foundation, of threats, of intimidation, of tactics that were absolutely shocking on the part of the Rwandan government. Here, an American human rights organization with no connection to Rwanda, other than the choice that we had made to honor this brave Rwandan, ourselves experienced some of that transnational intimidation. So only imagine how truly frightening it is for people in the Rwandan diaspora to be on the receiving end of these tactics. I want to take a moment to thank and to pay tribute to you, Terry George, for the extraordinary film that you made that told this inspiring story, again, of light shining in the darkness, of man's capacity for decency and courage in the face of terror and overwhelming odds. And I think I can say with no hesitation whatsoever that but for the film that you made and that Don Cheadle brought to life with his brilliant performance, Paul Rusesabagina would not be alive today. Paul Rusesabagina is alive because you told his story and told it in such a compelling way that it became the shorthand for the story of the whole tragedy of the Rwandan genocide globally. To this day, all you need to say, because not everybody knows the name Rusesabagina, you say, Hotel Rwanda, the hero of Hotel Rwanda, and suddenly their faces light up. They say, oh yes, we know, we understand. Now, the reality is that there is a shockingly long list now of victims of Paul Kagame. Those who dared to speak out, and as you said, Nicole, it is political opposition figures, critics, journalists. That's sort of the universe of people. And it is a longer list than I could recite right now of those who have disappeared, been imprisoned, been assassinated, been tortured. And Paul has now joined that list as he has become a victim of a kidnapping, a sham trial, torture in custody. And I fear with every fiber of my being that the goal is for him to die in prison under unspeakable conditions. So I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I do feel that the time has come to tell the second chapter of the story. I think the time has come, whether it's you, Terry, with your extraordinary gift for bringing to life stories we need to know, we need to be inspired by. Dawn, whether it's part of your mission to tell the next chapter, but it is now on us. At that moment when 1,100 people needed Paul to find all of his decency and courage to interpose himself between them and the forces of death and destruction, he did it. It is now incumbent on all of us to meet the moment as well. Some of our viewers may notice that I'm wearing it. I'll sit up so you can see it. I'm very proud to be wearing a free Paul Rusesabagina t-shirt. This is just a symbol of a movement that we want to seed and to feed and to build so that there will be tens of thousands of people, famous and unknown, wearing these t-shirts, telling this story, reaching out to your representatives in Congress, reaching out to the media, because this is a brave man who did what we all hope we would have done in his shoes, but he did it. And he has paid a price for doing it because he has become the target of a powerful man, the leader of Rwanda, who sadly has not lived up to the hopes we all had that he would not only be a healer of his country, but a leader who would lead with rule of law and democratic principles. He has become a dictator, and Paul has become his top target. So let us now follow in Paul Rusesabagina's very brave footsteps. Let us step forward. Let us interpose ourselves between Paul and a machinery of injustice that has sought to make him the latest victim. And I'm honored to be here with such a distinguished group of people all working together to free Paul Rusesabagina.
Thank you, Katrina, and thank you for that impassioned intervention, and just really appreciate it. Okay, so now it's time for the question and answers. This is going to be sort of a lightning round. So we'll ask, so we can get as many questions in as possible. I'm going to ask everybody to keep your answers brief, but with all of your heart. So I'm going to start here with you, Terry. Why do you think Paul was kidnapped, and why was he a target of the Rwandan regime?
Because he was, along with Paul Kagame, the most famous Rwandan perhaps in the world, and he represented the opposition to the Kagame regime. So he was the prize, he was the golden prize to be taken out, and that's why this elaborate kidnapping was organized. Paul represented the voice of exiled Rwandans around the world, and we've seen how ruthless Paul Kagame's regime has been. In South Africa, they committed assassinations. In Rwanda, the most famous gospel singer in Rwanda died in prison. There's just a litany of stuff, and Paul represented the focal point of opposition to Kagame. So he had to be taken out.
Thank you, Terry. Don, to you, apart from your personal link to Paul's story, why do you feel so strongly today that you are advocating on Paul's behalf?
Well, there is a Lao Tzu quote in the Tao Te Ching that states, "In action, watch the timing." And from the first day I learned about Paul's embezzlement and imprisonment, I started making phone calls to his family, to politicians, to friends of President Kagame, to lawyers, to organizations, basically to anybody I thought could help find a solution to this. I also simultaneously began to try to get my hands on information about the charges that Paul was accused of and try to find independent sources, if there were any, that could refute or even corroborate what was being claimed by the Rwandan government. And that was very difficult to do. But one thing was clear: they had him now, and they weren't going to let him go, not without first giving him a trial. None of us were very encouraged by that. A trial post-entrapment sounded like anything but fair, but if there was any hope, it was that irrespective of the way Paul was taken to Rwanda, there would at least now be an opportunity to have the facts laid out, witnesses and evidence presented, and for Paul to have the ability to mount a defense with a legal team of his choosing. There would be a proceeding for the entire world to see and ultimately engage with if it was determined that this was indeed a bad act. there would be on record something we could all point to that might compel the world to respond. Of course, that didn't happen. The trial was, all but a show, and the world's attention writ large has been focused on the pandemic, elections, strong men around the world, January 6th, the Super Bowl, and a host of other events that over the last 640 days, have been fighting for eyes and attention in this 24-hour news cycle. So here we are now, trying to collectively make noise, shine a light, draw attention to the circumstances, and we're hoping it's not too late. The judge presiding over Paul's case recently rejected the prosecution's appeal to increase Paul's sentence from 25 years to life, a decision that, on the face of it, might seem hopeful, but given Paul's state of health, it's all but irrelevant. If we're unable to persuade President Kagame to intercede and intervene on Paul's behalf, he will likely die in prison, and that would be awful. So we're all here now hoping to prevent that from occurring, not just for Paul and his family, but also, for the cause of justice in general.
Thank you, Don. Katrina, Paul is a U.S. permanent resident and a Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient. He is also a victim of transnational repression, but Rwanda is not an enemy state. They are an ally of the United States. With that said, why hasn't the United States government brought Paul home? If someone like Paul is kidnapped and our government does not put enormous pressure to bring him home immediately, what hope do other wrongfully detained U.S. citizens have if they are taken captive?
Well, you put your finger on something critically important. Our government has not stepped up to do what it must do. The United States has enormous influence and enormous leverage over Rwanda. Rwanda is a small country, tremendously dependent on international goodwill, international financial support. And I believe that if our State Department and if our White House had exerted the full extent of their leverage, Paul would not have been languishing under appalling circumstances for well over 500 days. We need to ramp up the pressure on our own government. I'm encouraged that there are increasingly leaders in Congress who are now not only speaking out, but they're using some of those key words. They're saying foreign aid will not be approved. We will put a hold on this. We will stop US government support for the government of Rwanda until this US permanent resident is released and returned to his family. It is inexcusable when we do not use our enormous leverage to free an international human rights hero. It's frustrating to me as a human rights activist when we don't do everything we can against big and powerful enemies or adversaries like China or Russia. But it's incomprehensible when we don't do it towards small and very dependent allied countries who really need to listen to what the United States says when we say, you are unlawfully holding this man. We demand his release. He's a permanent US resident. And if you want our support and our joint cooperation on many things to continue, you need to be responsive to this demand now. So no excuses. The pressure needs to be increased.
Thanks. Thank you, Katrina. And Kate, we've been talking a lot about the trial and about due process violations. But in the end, is this really a legal matter? Isn't it more a political issue? And what needs to be done next?
Yes, no one who's followed this case would recognize it as a legitimate legal process. This is the deliberate targeting of an activist, someone who says things that the regime doesn't like or asks questions to which there aren't easy answers. So what we've seen isn't a normal arrest, trial, appeal. We see the removal of an opponent from public space, the silencing of a critic. And that's entirely political. That is extrajudicial. And we've heard from Terry and Nicole and Katrina that this isn't unique to Paul. He is one person on a growing list inside and outside of Rwanda who have spoken up and been arrested and disappeared or killed. What do we do next? It's important that we recognize that it's happening. It's important that more and more people can see now and recognize that it's happening. And we just can't stop talking about it until this practice itself ends.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So now it's time for our call to action. I want to thank all of our listeners for coming. I want to thank again our panelists for your interventions and for your huge hearts and for caring so much for this extraordinary hero. You've heard Paul's story, and I hope this has moved you to action. As I said earlier, we need to make sure that the Rwandan government, the US government, the Belgian government, and the world hear the words of these reports of Paul's rights were violated and he should be released immediately. Those of us on this panel today are working hard for his release. Some of us are wearing the free Rusesabagina t-shirts, and those are available for others. We have also been joined by many of our friends in Hollywood, in the arts, and in public life, and we hope you will join us as well. We will be tweeting about Paul, and we need everyone to retweet free Rusesabagina. The message needs to get out on social media starting now, and you can share your thoughts and create your own messages. You can join the campaign by buying a t-shirt, calling the White House at 202-456-1414. You can sign the change.org petition and share it with your friends, with your families, and on social media. And for more information, you can go to www.paulr.org. That's www.paulr.org. We need to make Paul's name and cause household words. Please help however you can. And again, I want to thank our panelists. I want to especially thank Annalise. You're closest to Paul. He's your dad. We love you so much for coming here. Our hearts are with you. Our hearts are with you. We will not stop until your dad is free. We want you to know that. We're all in this together. We're working with you shoulder to shoulder to free Paul. Thank you so much, everybody.